Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Andrew Kaufman. We exercise our role as humans in a natural way versus being part of some kind of slave control system. What exactly is going on in the world right now?
I know the cost of stepping out of the mainstream and actually telling the truth.
Thank you.
Dr. Andrew, how are you, sir?
I'm doing well this fine day. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much for joining us on the Bought the T-Shirt podcast. A subject close to both our hearts. Just as a start, how have you been keeping in yourself? It's hard to speak the truth, is it not?
Well, it's both difficult and also very fulfilling. So it is somewhat of a divine mixture, perhaps. And I see trying to discover the truth about the natural world and educating other people about those truths as a part of my development and my contribution to the world. And that really sustains me. And of course, there are a lot of people who don't want to hear that. And so that kind of resistance and polarization is going on. But I don't think that's a personal affront. It's simply the condition that we are in and the times that we are experiencing. And so no one is really immune, but it's important in order for the future to be one where we exercise our role as humans in a natural way versus being part of some kind of slave control system.
Yes, I just very briefly, Dr. Andy, I'll just tell you my story and why this is why my interest peaked, obviously, over the last 2.5 years. Is I started to eat lots of vegetables, not 19 years ago. I got introduced to the notion that all our bodies have a pH balance, and I was one of these people that I was ill 3 times a year, if not more. I had the colds, the flus, the coughs, and back then we didn't know any different, but to like blame it on Dave in the office. I've caught this thing off him, and da da da. And what I found is by keeping my my pH, friends at home, if you're wondering why I'm holding this up, these are test strips that anyone can buy. You can get them for like $2.99 on eBay. Like I haven't been ill in 19 years. So right from the get-go, when someone tries to tell me there's something like I can catch off I'm a bit like, I don't think so. I think there's more to this than meets the eye, can we say? How did it start for you, Andy? What was your first, because the whole university system and the peer reviewed kind of thing all falls on its ass if everyone's been fed the wrong information from the start, or they've been coerced into, it's all well and good having research, but if it's paid for example, by big pharmaceutical companies, then it's going to be steered in their interest. And yourself as a doctor, how did you start to see through this?
Well, there were really a number of experiences which I had over time, because when I went into medicine at first, of course, like I thought it was amazing and miraculous. And I really wanted to learn about the body, and I wanted to be able to help individuals who were suffering. And my first real clinical experience as a professional was actually as a physician assistant, which I did before I went to medical school, and I worked in cancer medicine and bone marrow transplant. And what I saw there is, and I didn't realize this all at the time because we have the expectation that people with cancer are not going to do well. But I saw just every single patient die, with the exceptions of one rare form of leukemia where they were able to recover and be cured, except in those cases we didn't use chemotherapy. We gave a form of vitamin A. And it really didn't occur to me that this division, like I was, it was always exciting when we got someone with this rare leukemia, and there were only a handful over the 2 years that I did this work. But it didn't occur to me that, the treatment was just something from nature rather than some chemical poison that originally was based on nerve gas, used in wartime. So I started developing this kind of, seed of a thought. And then when I was later on, I went back to medical school, and then I decided to do my residency training in psychiatry, and I was at Duke University. And in my first year there, they had this mandatory course for all of the first and second year residents, and it's a 4-year training program, where we did what they called a critical appraisal of the literature. And we looked at clinical studies, mostly involving psychiatric medications or other psychiatric-related instruments or therapies. And we learned how to do a critical analysis. So we learned about different type of clinical trial designs and how to analyze the statistics. And what we saw essentially is that many of these published papers were disingenuous, and they had all kinds of biases, and this played out on so many levels. I even saw it actually happen with a junior faculty who was working on a research project with like the big guy, the chairman, and it was funded by a pharmaceutical company, like you mentioned, and they were looking at people who had heart attacks and depression, and could they improve outcomes with an antidepressant drug. And I saw that they were basically recruiting people who didn't have depression, that they had like a problem, like a conflict in their family that was stressing them out. And they knew that if they put them on Zoloft and helped them deal with the conflict, they would get a good result. And so they recruited those people, even though they didn't meet the criteria for the study, because they had pressures to meet recruitment targets and they wanted everything to like be favorable so they would get future grants, right? And so all these biases play out, and many of them are invisible unless you're part of this establishment. But you can also just read papers and find out that these conclusions aren't true. But here was the real difficulty or conflict that was created, because we reviewed this paper about antidepressants from, I think it was from the one of the American Medical Association journals. And what happened is a statistician put in a Freedom of Information Act request for all of the studies submitted to the FDA to get approval for antidepressants, because they don't publish all the studies. They only publish studies which have favorable results. If they have a study that shows negative results for their drug, they don't publish it, but they still submit that to the FDA. So this statistician took all of the data from all of these studies given to the FDA and put them together into one analysis, and that's called a meta-analysis. It's a very powerful tool if it's done well. And it essentially showed that there was really no meaningful difference between antidepressants and placebos. And everyone in that class, including the faculty, all agreed that, as a result of this, we can we can say with fair certainty that antidepressants are only placebos. And of course, that means we shouldn't use them because it's considered unethical to use placebos in medicine these days. So, but then the next day, or even later that day, we go to the clinic, and then we're told by the same faculty to prescribe antidepressants. And that really was uncomfortable for me. And that's when I began my very conservative approach to medications, which over time led to me taking all my patients off medications. And that was kind of the last way that I could stay in the system before I realized I had to leave that system completely. But I experienced directly teenagers, many of them getting suicidal thoughts from taking antidepressants, and when I took them off the drug, the suicidal thoughts disappeared. I saw, teenager after teenager who was prescribed stimulants for ADHD having growth retardation, and when I took them off those stimulants, which, by the way, are really no different from methamphetamine or crystal meth or cocaine, they suddenly shot up like weeds. I mean, they had major growth spurts. All these kids were kind of living with being short, having this kind of Napoleonic experience when really they were average height or taller, and according to their biological potential, but we were suppressing it, right? And I came across this study from Tennessee where they looked at all of the Medicaid recipients. That's a health program for poor individuals and disabled, and all of the children in the Medicaid program in Tennessee. Many of them were given antipsychotic drugs because of this whole collusion between academic psychiatrists and the pharmaceutical industry to promote these things in teenagers, saying that their bad behavior is really bipolar disorder. And it turns out that a really staggering proportion of these children in Tennessee experienced sudden death. But these things all, led me on a path of separating from that system.
How is it, Andy, that we've got in this situation where any kind of holistic health approaches are now almost laughed upon? Which is kind of, if you look at a mammal in the nature, when they get ill, this is what my research has led me to understand, is that the first thing they do is fast. They'll take them as, they'll stop eating. In the immediate instant, they might even stop drinking. Just, I'm guessing, to rest their bodies, give them time to recuperate, and then build back up on. I don't know if we're talking in the human sphere. I would say,
yeah, Chris, you'd be interested to know that even in the mainstream medical research literature, they have studied fasting with injuries and have found, because, you're absolutely correct, this is the model of nature. All animals, when they're injured or sick, will fast. Some of them, completely, but, these animals are well hydrated to begin with. So if they dry fast, it's because that's what nature is telling them to do. They don't have the thirst. And have studied this and found that it accelerates wound healing and recovery from injuries. So, this knowledge is there even in the mainstream. Of course, it's just suppressed or ignored, as you mentioned. And this originally comes from an infiltration of the healthcare education system by the, robber barons and the Rockefeller group, where they created the American Medical Association and came up with the Flexner Report, which basically laid the groundwork for a pharmaceutical industrial complex monopoly. And they are the ones that are responsible through their public relations campaigns for, ridiculing any other approach outside of their system. But what I've learned over the last 6 years approximately, through studying this and through direct experience, observation of individuals who are using these natural methods that we alluded to, that they actually have amazing health outcomes, that all of these chronic illnesses, which we're told are incurable and that the pharmaceutical industry would want you to take drugs to manage your symptoms or have surgical procedures or get further diagnostic tests, if that people can completely recover from these things. So like autoimmune disease, neurodevelopmental disorders, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, etc.
Yeah, so we kind of been sold the line that without big pharma, there's no other option, and yet
That's correct.
Just a bit of history and a little bit of common sense.
Well, you know though that the doctor, right, the white-coated doctor, is a sacrosanct figure in our culture, right? Since we're very, very young, we, have this exalted image of doctors. And even if you look at sociological studies of, prestige, you can find that doctors among the highest. Now, it's interesting that if you look at doctors, they have high rates of addiction, they don't live very long, et cetera, et cetera. But in terms of how society views them, right? They are on this kind of stage, and it's very difficult for individuals to get past that and see that. And it may not be that the doctor's a bad guy or a bad girl. It may be that they just are put through the system and they're indoctrinated, and they haven't looked outside of it. They haven't had the ability to question things or even just observe what's happening right in front of them with their own patients, because what they'll see is that the pills that they're prescribing are not improving any outcomes, that people just get sicker and sicker. I saw this when I was in mainstream medicine, and I was like, what about all these, cures that were promised? Like when I was a kid, it was the era of, molecular biology expanding. I even studied this in university. And there were all these promises that, we're on the verge of understanding and curing all of these diseases, cancer, lupus, et cetera, et cetera. And then now I've, been in that system for decades since I began my education. And where are they? Where are the magic cures? Right? There are none to speak of, and there are never going to be any because that approach is really only poisoning you and keeping you sick. And when those drugs result in improvement of your symptoms, they're essentially suppressing your body's normal healing functions. And that is part of what perpetuates the chronic illness, because it turns off your body's healing systems, which you might experience some discomfort with. And I believe that is actually an important piece of information, because that discomfort informs you to make changes in your behavior to avoid the problem. It's just like if you went to the beach on a hot summer day and started walking on the hot sand in bare feet, you would experience a strong pain signal that would tell you, stop walking on this hot sand or you're going to burn yourself. And what do? You put on some sandals or you go to the water. I had a colleague way back in my physician assistant days who had diabetes and a neuropathy, which means that she had numbness or inability to feel temperature and pain in her feet and her fingertips. And she went to the beach, this was in South Carolina where it's really hot, and ended up with second-degree burns on her feet. And she showed up for work on Monday in a wheelchair with her feet all bandaged up. So that's a great lesson of what happens when we ignore the discomfort signals from our body, which are trying to tell us that we are doing something, maybe unintentionally most likely, that's harming our body. Just like earlier in your life when you may have been eating a bunch of processed food and doing other unhealthy things, but you didn't realize, because we've all been misinformed about what brings about bad health, and we've all been misinformed about what good nutrition is. Right? So you didn't know, but your body was still giving you signals at that time that you didn't know how to interpret, or you didn't think were information. You thought it was a sign of, perhaps just being unlucky and suffering, or maybe just it's a part of the aging process, when really it was about what you were doing in life. And once you realized that and changed it, right, then all these things improved massively for you.
I tell you something, Dr. Andrew, you're an absolute legend. You really are. No, I mean, it needs to be said. the world is under such a massive lie. This almost this hypnosis, I think. Friends at home, this affects us all. How many times a year do you get someone come up to you and say, "Oh, Chris, my so-and-so's dying of cancer," and it's got to the point where, like, you can't say anything to these, and you can't say, "Do you know what? Like, if your body's created that, you can actually reverse it." Do you know about terrain theory? Do you understand how cells work? Even in a basic level, and the fact that we can have this conversation, I think, is just a great step forward. And I asked you at the beginning, how are you and yourselves? Because I know the cost of stepping out of the mainstream and actually telling the truth. And so over the last 2.5 years, very few people have done it. Even those that know, or that certainly have their, they've shut up. And it comes at a cost. And but as you said, Doctor, also the benefits of being able to give out, we can sort of, work that out in our mind, I can say. Can we go back? Because a lot of people won't be aware that modern medicine is all based on well, essentially, what's the word?
Pseudoscience?
Yeah, I wanted to talk about germ theory and Louis Pasteur and Antoine Beauchamp, to try to help people understand the difference between what modern medicine's based on, which is what I call a bogeyman, is like this magic illness that can jump from one person into another one, and oh my God, you're all going to die in your beds, as opposed to terrain. So should we talk about Pasteur and Beauchamp? I don't even know if I say it right.
That's okay. It's very hard. I believe it's Beauchamp.
Beauchamp. Okay. Yes.
But yeah, so these are, two scientists, one who has been, sort of idolized through history, and things are named after him, Louis Pasteur, and Antoine Beauchamp, who is, most people have no idea that he ever existed. But this was a very interesting dynamic. And there's a good book written about this, but essentially Beauchamp was a real serious scientist, and he was studying, the origins of microbial life. And he was doing this by looking at fermentation, right, which is how we make spirits or vinegar and things like that. So where we have microorganisms that consume some food, like a source of sugar, and then they metabolize that and create some product, right? It could be acetic acid, which is vinegar. It could be ethanol, or it could be actually convert sugar, like to grape sugar, for example, is another output. So Beauchamp was studying this, and at first he did experiments where it seemed that there was something in the air that needed to go into the experiment to make fermentation happen. And originally, Pasteur, who was looking at Beauchamp's work, but they were not colleagues, originally believed in what's called spontaneous generation, that organisms just appeared out of thin air. And then after a while, he adopted these experiments from Beauchamp, which really laid the foundation for some of the germ theory beliefs that we have today, based on that experiment I just told you. And started, but he didn't do really original science himself. He replicated some of Beauchamp's experiment, but did those in a sensationalized way with a lot of publicity and was trying to ingratiate himself to the French aristocracy. And he was very successful. That's why he was called upon by the government to deal with some public health issues, and eventually came up with the pasteurization process, which we know is still used today. In fact, it's illegal to sell certain dairy products in the United States and most states without pasteurization. But Beauchamp continued further experiments showing that you could have fermentation based on microorganisms that were in the plant or in the animal that didn't come from the outside. And then he found these little particles, which he called microzyma. And these are kind of like the stem cells for bacteria and fungi. And they can develop and change shape, just like our own stem cells can, into different types of microorganisms. And these things exist in organic or natural materials, not just in organisms, but actually in minerals. So he did experiments where he had chalk that was mined from the earth, and there were microzyma in the chalk that were able to, given the right environmental conditions, develop into microorganisms and carry out fermentation. Whereas when he did the same experiment with chalk from a manufacturing facility, man-made, there was no fermentation, because that was created in an unnatural way and didn't have these little microzyma. And several other scientists have picked up on this work, and the general field is called pleomorphism, and it is a theory under the umbrella of terrain biology or terrain medicine. And it's been really ignored by the mainstream, because one of the issues we have in medical science is that the mainstream medical science only looks under the microscope at dead tissue, whereas Beauchamp and others, such as Gaston Naessens and Enderlein, looked through a microscope at living cells. And that's where they could all see these little microbial stem cells, and they gave them different names, of course, but they all observed the same cycle where they could change shapes and into different forms. So this science was never integrated in the mainstream. Instead, Pasteur's ideas about that there are germs in the air, and since they can go into a vessel and result in fermentation, then that would mean they could also go into our bodies and eat us from the inside, causing disease. And that has been permeated, and is the central idea, right, basically, of this warfare model, that there are unseen forces to make us sick, and there's nothing we can do about it except go to the white-coated doctor and get the magic potion, or get sliced up by the surgeon in order for a cure. And that is essentially the paradigm of modern medicine. However, there is no scientific experiments using the scientific method that back up any of those ideas. And in fact, the experimental results disprove those things. Like, for example, streptococcus, that's said to cause disease, right, a strep throat and other diseases. Why is it, if we just swab our throat when we're healthy, we also find streptococcus bacteria? So how could it be there if we're healthy, if it causes us to be sick, right? That, just a simple analysis like that is very, very helpful. But when they tried to give these organisms, to experimental hosts, they didn't get sick. There's a famous microbiology professor around the early 20th century who used to swallow a pure culture of cholera bacteria every year in front of his students, and then they would observe he would never get sick. And now it's known that only when cholera bacteria feed on sewage contaminated water, they create a waste product that's toxic called cholera toxin. And if you drink the water with that toxin, you get cholera. But the bacteria doesn't cause anything. It would be, like eating someone else's poop and getting sick. And it really kind of is, because that bacteria is trying to clean up the sewage in the water, which we already know is not good to drink. So it has nothing to do with the bacteria. But they've essentially created some crazy experiments to try and back up this theory. But all of the real experiments using the scientific method have essentially disproven that these germs cause disease.
So, doctor, essentially, the illness comes from within. You mentioned pleomorphism.
Well, pleomorphism is not illness.
It's your cell that can change, that has a function in it, and that function is to save your life. Think about it a little bit more simply, because everyone's familiar with the gut microbiome, right? That we have all these different microorganisms in our gut, and that they're important for our health. And this is why people take actually capsules filled with bacteria, right, to sort of give the good bacteria back to our gut. Well, what is actually going on is that throughout our entire body, there are microorganisms in different forms. By most mainstream estimates, they outnumber our human cells about 10 to 1, even though they're much smaller in size. And what we can learn from pleomorphism is that these bacterial and fungal forms actually develop right out of our own body from these little stem cells, which we can observe in a live blood sample, for example. And in someone with, what happens is often if there is a tissue injury, like something that causes damage to the body, right, which could come from food, air pollution, injections, medications, many, many things, right? Drinking too much alcohol. These things will damage our body. Our body can develop the appropriate microorganism to help recycle the damaged material from our body, right? And they're kind of nature's recyclers. We can look out in nature, actually, and find lots of examples when there's dead biological material, like branches and leaves that fall off the tree, for example, or animals who perish. And there's all this whole cycle of natural scavengers that consume that flesh so that it could be reduced back into the earth and bring forth new life, right? This awesome natural cycle. When we have a compost pile in our backyard, what happens is the microorganisms from within that material we put in the compost pile began digesting it and reduce it into, humus, essentially the basic elements. And then we call it compost. And then we mix that in the soil to put that nutrition or those elements back into it. And the microorganisms in our body do the same exact thing. So let's say, for example, we, drink toxic, beverages like sodas, for example, or energy drinks, or pasteurized, factory milk that has all kinds of hormones and antibiotics and other things in it, and it damages the tissue in our throat every time we swallow it. And that damage builds up to a point where the body has to initiate a healing process. And part of that healing process is to remove the damaged tissue, right? And this is something that happens during fasting, by the way. It's accelerated. We call it autophagy, or the body eating itself. But it's like all the damaged proteins get recycled. Any cells that are no longer viable undergo a sort of a self-destruct sequence. And then all that material is eaten up by these microorganisms that can help get it out of the body or make it into a reusable nutrient. And that's what we experience like during the inflammatory process. And when we have secretions, like all of the snot that comes out of your nose, or the pus that might develop in the back of your throat and drip down, that's your body's mechanism of getting rid of those waste products, like they're dripping out of the body. Anytime stuff is coming out of your body, other than for sexual lubrication, I think might be the one exception, or maybe salivation for digestion. But generally speaking, when fluids are coming out of your body, it's your body's trying to get rid of something, right? That's what diarrhea is.
That's what a runny nose is. That's what coughing is. That's what a fever and sweating is. All these mechanisms, even when you sweat into your armpits, that your body's getting rid of waste products. That's why it sometimes smells bad. And the more of a toxic lifestyle you have, the worse your body odor will be for many people who have developed this pathway.
Can I just say, Andy, a lot of people won't realize that when you eat what I call a majority plant-based diet, which is what myself and my girlfriend moved, you no longer have to use deodorant. I think a lot of people wouldn't realize this. And yet
I think it's really about eating a clean diet, and I think there are a lot of different ways that you can do that. And also, like I'm a little bit skeptical of the term plant-based, because many people use that to describe processed pea protein powders and tofu and things like that. And those things are very damaging to eat. So I kind of talk about a whole food diet, right? Where so if you're eating plants, right, you're eating raw fruits and lettuces, and then you're eating vegetables of various things, but in their whole form. So in other words, not processed flours,
yeah.
right? Or things like that.
So you're more
right?
articulate than me, Doctor.
Well, no, that's it. Listen, it's just that I've been studying nutrition for decades, and have gone through a lot of different cycles about what I think is healthy or not healthy. I've experimented with some extreme diets, like the Dean Ornish ultra low fat diet, etc. And I realized that it's extremely difficult to know what is the best thing to eat for health, or what humans' real natural diet is. There are different ways to look at these things, but there's so much misinformation and confusion and conflation of various factors out there. It's really difficult to know what the best thing to eat is. But if you simply think like, I want something as close to nature as possible, right? So if I go to the nectarine tree, pick a nectarine off the tree and eat it, that's very close. Like, that's as close as you can get to nature.
Yes.
Right. And that's what the way you want to think about nutrition to really restore your health.
Yes, exactly. Sorry, it is a confusing term. I should just say that I'm not like a vegetarian or a vegan, like 100%, but if you look at my plate in a restaurant or at a meal, it's going to be mostly vegetables, preferably green vegetables. Still eat meat, still eat carbohydrates, but I just try to keep that down. And as we were saying, one of the things I noticed is that you don't smell awfully anymore. It's the same when you take medication. You suddenly you can smell it coming out of your you can smell the difference coming out of your body. It's I'm only mentioning it because a lot of people probably would never have. Most people just slap on the deodorant every morning,
Yes.
and otherwise I'm going to stink. And life doesn't have to be that way.
Absolutely correct.
We've done really well, Doctor, to not mention the old C word and the old V word, which is great as far as a certain video platform is. I think everyone knows the one I'm referring to. I don't know if we can continue that, but
listen, if you have my name associated with it on YouTube, there's a risk just based on that.
Okay.
It will get censored. So, but I can be very sensitive to the language, even if you want to.
Yeah. We've got a lot of other platforms, Doctor. Don't worry, and my editor Luke he's very savvy now, because we managed to survive the last 2.5 years without getting taken down. I think we're one of the few channels that have, and it's because we've learned to avoid certain buzzwords, but and we'll do whatever. So don't worry. If we need to say stuff, we need to say it because the truth needs to get out there. But what I wanted to say is, so what is your elevator pitch on what the hell has happened this last 2 years?
Wow. Well, what I think has happened is that we have had a major psychological operation that was put forth to institute some of these globalist plans that are outlined in the Great Reset, Agenda 21 from the United Nations, from other documents and other foundations that you can look at, the CFR, the Rockefeller Foundation, et cetera, et cetera. There are many of them. And the coordination level of planning and execution was really quite impressive, including the psychological aspects were really done extremely well. That the majority of men and women the world over have been completely fooled. It's important to realize that there are ways to look at nature and develop understanding. And there are two ways that I think about it. One is simply observing nature and natural phenomenon. So, what we call an illness, if that's what it really is, because it may actually be a healing episode, but we'll stick with illness for now, right? That's something we can observe in nature. We see, okay, Johnny starts coughing and gets sick, right? Or, cousin Bertha has a growth on her leg. For example, we could all look at it and we could say there's something there that's different. But by making those observations, it tells us nothing about the cause of those illnesses. And this observation field is epidemiology. Right? So this is like, saying, oh, how many people are sick with respiratory symptoms? How many people are sick with heart attacks? How many people died of a heart attack? Right? It's just an observation. It doesn't speak to what causes heart attacks, or it doesn't speak to what causes respiratory symptoms. And we can observe, people getting ill, we can observe people dying, but it tells us, it doesn't tell us what caused that outcome. If we want to determine the cause, we have to, think further about, what are my guesses at the cause of this? And then we can design an experiment to test that. So if we think, there's this cause of something from nature, we can get that thing from nature, we can put it in some experimental subjects and see if they develop the same illness. But for your case, we can't really go back and do an experiment because, it's already in the past. And we'd have to think about. Now, one idea that makes sense to me is that all those years that you weren't sick, your body was still probably exposed to toxins and they could have been accumulating. So when you finally, your body was ready to go through a cleansing and you got sick, it had built up a little bit more and it took a little bit longer for you to cough those things out. So your cough lingered. But I'll tell you that every single year during flu and cold season, there have been lots of people who got an acute illness and then their cough lingered. In fact, I experienced that myself, earlier in life. And it's nothing new or distinguishing from the past. So we can't say, there's no basis to say that it's anything new. Even when, normally if you had a health crisis, right, where suddenly you were noticing individuals getting sick in a different way or dying in a different way that was unexplained, what you would do is you would autopsy every single individual who died of that, right? And you would take fluid and tissue samples from people who presented the illness but were still alive. And you would look for distinguishing factors. And we have these for, many illnesses, like, for example, Alzheimer's disease. If someone dies of that and you look at their brain under a microscope, you find very unique things that you don't find in other diseases. And that tells you that this is a unique process. Now, it actually overlaps with some other dementias. So you could say maybe those are really the same thing, but it looks totally different from someone who's had a stroke. Or someone who has multiple sclerosis, right? So you can definitely say these are different in some way, right? They're different disease presentations. But when they did some small autopsy series during the last couple of years, there were no findings on the autopsy that were different.
Coming on to your documentary, Doctor, how has it been received?
It's been very well received. Actually, I have a meeting a little bit later after this to discuss international distribution. We've been trying to work on getting it out to a more mainstream audience, but in the meantime, it's been definitely viewed about 250,000 times at least. It's on various platforms. We offer licenses that people can do screenings in person, like in their community, and we've done several of those. And we offer that for free for groups that don't have resources or a very minimal licensing fee. So we're trying to make it as accessible as possible. I've screened it at a few conferences. I may screen it at Anarchapulco this February, an excellent conference there. So it's been amazing, but of course it's not on Netflix where it could be viewed by a wider audience. And although we're trying to reach some platforms that have somewhere close to that kind of reach, but I think it could be, much more impactful. But people who have seen it have really appreciated the honesty involved, and they appreciate my fortitude, dealing with members of the public like the police, in a calm way, trying to show the injustices that we have experienced during this last few years as a result of a corruption of the truth.
Mm. And what was it? Was it yourself that decided to put this documentary together, or was it between you and your colleagues?
Well, this was really a collaboration with filmmaker Marcy Cravat. We had a phone call, and she was just so curious and wanted to know and ask a million questions and read everything that I would recommend to her to understand this topic. And she had made such beautiful films. It was like a natural collaboration. So when I thought, do I write a book or make a film? I thought a film would be more accessible to most people to do first, although I'm working on a book now. And I just pitched it to Marcy. I'm like, Marcy, you seem like the perfect person to do this. And she was really gung-ho from the beginning. And, she created an amazing movie, by using my content. And of course, we connected with all these other amazing researchers and doctors to contribute to the film, and other people from the community who were, kind of grassroots activists to show not just, it's not just a talking head scientific documentary film. We mix the important scientific truths with the human experience and we're trying to bring about this paradigm shift, from this toxic germ theory model to a model that is respective and inclusive of nature, which, we can call the terrain medicine umbrella like we talked about today. So I think, someone can view this and get the idea of, how we got into this mess and what is the way out that best respects the human potential.
I think we're all on the same hymn sheet. That illness comes from within if we don't look after ourselves.
Well, when you say comes from within,
sorry, all contaminants pollutions in the environment. Is that what you were going to say?
Well, I was just wanted to hear your explanation. I was a little unclear, but please continue.
Yeah, no, I just massively think the vast majority of illnesses, we are what we eat. And I think we've been led in the Western world to think you can literally binge out on Coca-Cola and Big Macs, and that there's nothing to, there's no deficit, there's nothing to pay for that. Well, I would say there is. You don't feed your plants Coca-Cola because they'd die they would die within a week, and everyone would look at you like you're mad. And yet,
there is a film. Actually, it's a sarcastic film about the future, and they actually do feed the plants with Gatorade, and they can't understand why the plants are dying.
I think it's called Bondo. Bondo is good for crops. Yes, idiocracy, which is what
yes,
which is the dumbed down state that we're facing. I know you've got to go, so ordinarily I say stay behind so I can thank you properly. But no, just Doctor, get on the road. Just take my massive love from all of our subscribers to you and your wonderful family, and massive thank you to everybody that put the documentary together. And the future's bright, and the future is ours.
Absolutely. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk, and I'd be happy to come back and speak more anytime.
Definitely. And that invite is always, anything I can do, please let me know. And friends at home, massive love to you too. If you could like and subscribe, that would be brilliant. And we'll see you in the truth next time. Thank you.